spoilers for anime that came out almost 2 decades ago. Wait, Death Note and Code Geass were released over 17 years ago? Holy crap, I'm old. When first getting into anime, there are a handful of titles that people like to refer to as the Weeaboo Starter Pack. These are your My Hero Academias, your Demon Slayers, Attack on Titan, or if you're a fossil like me, things like Sword Art Online, Bleach, and Naruto. These are the anime that have, for better or for worse, broken out of the anime community and into mainstream Western culture. They still might not be as well known as stuff like Star Wars, Marvel, or Batman, but chances are that people might have heard of these in passing whenever the topic of anime comes up. Death Note is one of those titles, with its popularity in the West becoming the gateway for many into the medium of anime. The iconic notebook from the series still shows up in pop culture to this day, and I'm not here to deny that it has had a lasting impact on the anime community, or that it isn't an important series. I just think that it sucks. I'm sure that most of the audience for this video is already familiar with the basic premise for the series, but just in case, I'll give a brief synopsis for those who haven't looked into it before. Death Note is about a high school guy named Light who randomly comes across a supernatural notebook that, if you write someone's name in it while picturing their face in your mind, will cause that person to die. He then goes on an egotistical rampage, killing anyone who shows up on the local news as a recently convicted criminal in a misguided attempt to change the world into one free of evil. A genius savant by the name of L, the world's #1 detective, then launches an investigation into the mysterious criminal killer now known by the public as Kira. And pretty much the entire rest of the show is the cat and mouse game between Light and L. Light is trying to kill L so that he can continue his reign of terror as Kira, and L is trying to arrest Light to bring him to justice. This lightweight premise is by far the strongest suit of the entire series. It's just a shame that the show seems to squander basically every opportunity it has at making an actually compelling narrative. Starting with the main character, I hate Light Yagami, and not for the right reasons. I get that he's not your typical protagonist, or even an anti-hero. However, this doesn't excuse the fact that he's just so stupid. If there's any perfect example of intelligence not being the same as wisdom, well, that would be Elon Musk, but the second best example would be Light Yagami. He basically chooses to wield the power of the Death Note, something that allows you to control the exact circumstances of someone's death down to the exact time and method, so long as it's plausible, in the most boring way possible. You see, if you don't specify a cause or time of death, then the person you write down in the Death Note will suffer a fatal heart attack in 40 seconds. This, in my opinion, is a total cop-out. Yeah, I get that Light is trying to min-max his KD ratio, but this makes the Death Note an immensely boring plot device. You want to know an easy fix that would have made the power of the Death Note more interesting and make Light seem more clever at the same time? Make it so that the cause of death has to be specified and it can't be repeated. With that one change, Light now has to figure out hundreds of different ways someone could die or be killed on his own if he wants to keep up his murder spree. It also adds the possibility of him saving the more easy causes of death in his back pocket for targets that he wants to make sure get taken out, and potential drama for when all the easy solutions get used up. Another frustrating thing is that Light never tests the limits of the Death Note's power unless he is literally forced to, which is yet another reason why he's so boring with how he uses said power. It never occurred to you that if you kept killing people at around the same time of day, that someone would think to analyze what time zone that would best fit? In general, despite the lengths the series goes through to try and show how Light is safeguarding his identity, he really does have awful OPSEC. In one fell swoop, someone was not only able to identify that Light was someone from Japan, but someone who only targeted people broadcast in a specific region of Japan. That's another thing. Despite all the grandiose posturing Light has whenever he goes on about how he's going to change the world with the Death Note, he's really narrow-minded when he comes to go about using it. He only ever goes after the small fry, and never any corrupt politicians, crime lords, or billionaires. At best, he's only ever magnifying the fear of getting caught, instead of using his supposedly amazing detective skills to figure out the true culprits and put a stop to them. In general, the series really only pays lip service to the idea that Light is changing the world. For all intents and purposes, its scope basically stays in Japan, and only occasionally the US gets involved. That's another thing. There was such huge potential for the series to delve into political intrigue, and it completely skips past it in favor of the rivalry between Light and L. You mean to tell me that somehow, criminals start dropping dead because of heart attacks despite no evidence of foul play, and all of the world's best detectives and various intelligence officers immediately jump to assuming it's the work of one guy? It's like the author has never heard of Occam's razor. It's far more reasonable to start with the most plausible explanation first, and then work your way down from there as you find evidence to disprove it. And you want to know what I think is a far better starting point? A nation-state actor. Think about it. Which sounds more likely? One guy is somehow killing criminals across the nation with no trace of having set foot in the jails the victims were kept in, or that some kind of organized force is testing out a new chemical weapon that can cause heart attacks with no traces on toxicology reports. The author had a huge opportunity to have the mind games start from within those investigating the Death Note phenomena from the very beginning, because, let's be real here, pretty much every government is going to suspect the other of having some kind of new weapon at play here. Okay, so maybe the author didn't want to do a political intrigue story, and instead wanted to focus on the more personal Sherlock versus Moriarty dynamic. This brings me to my next source of ire, L. Just like how the series keeps telling us that Light is supposedly some genius amongst his peers, the way that L is written also goes right into the pitfall of telling us that he's super smart, while not really doing much to earn his reputation as the world's #1 detective. And #2 and #3, apparently. Whoa, watch out! Bro's been smurfing in the ranked competitive detective queue. In fairness, the move he pulled to narrow down Kira to a specific region of Japan was a good step in the right direction in terms of establishing L as a rival to Light, but this comes off as less L exploiting an oversight in Light's modus operandi, and more of Light just being extremely sloppy, and it only goes downhill for the rest of the entire series. L's line of investigation becomes less logical with each episode, and it really starts to boil down to just, I have a hunch. Look, I get that sometimes you gotta go with your gut, and oftentimes hunches do actually lead to somewhere. But you can't let that be your sole line of reasoning for over half the series. That's just too irrational to carry the lengths that L goes through to try and pin Light as Kira. With how irrational L is being, I'm really surprised that Light didn't try to discredit him by persuading others that L is trying to frame Light as Kira. I also just have a huge dislike for how quickly the series rushes setting up L as Light's rival, when they could have used the process of eliminating the more plausible explanations for the Kira scenario down to actually deducing it's the work of one person as a way to show L's intellectual prowess. My issues with the characters of the series don't end with the two main characters though. Exhibit 3 of wasted character potential is Misa. Ugh, just thinking about her gives me a headache. The idea of someone else obtaining Death Note powers and becoming a Kira copycat is actually not a bad one. However, rather than exploring any actually interesting directions they could have gone with this, they instead turn her into a glorified vehicle for fan service, and also, weirdly enough, a walking opportunity for Light to be misogynistic. In general, introducing another Death Note wielder into the series would have been an excellent opportunity to show a differing perspective on how one should use its powers. If you ask 10 different people how they would use the Death Note, I'm sure you're going to get 10 different answers. Sure, there's going to be a lot of overlap, because I'm sure most people would try to use it to kill bad guys, but you'd be surprised at how many different angles you could come at it from. One example that stood out to me when I had this conversation with a friend is that they would use it to become an angel of mercy for the terminally ill. This is something that I hadn't even considered up until that point. Imagine the drama the series could have kicked up if you had the two Death Note wielders get into an argument over how best to use the notebooks. It was an easy opportunity to bring up the themes of whether or not it's ever okay to kill another human, philosophies of life and death, good and evil, etc. This ideological clash, which the series clearly tries to use as the foundation for the conflict between Light and L, is never really explored beyond basic platitudes. Anytime a character does try to bring up moral nuance, such as the fact that Kira succeeded in reducing crime rates, it's almost as quickly dismissed because apparently everyone in the series is the type of person who gets skittish whenever the trolley problem gets brought up. And I bet pretty much all of them are the kind of person who thinks that there's a secret third option where nobody dies. Spoiler alert, there isn't. Man, even the Shinigami are underused. They're basically there to be occasional rule clarification machines and hardly participate in the plot. When they do, it's either unintentionally hilarious or yet another missed opportunity. The biggest example of this is when the third Shinigami shows up, because Ryuk stole his Death Note. That would have been the perfect time to show what happens when Shinigami actually have beef with each other. Like, come on, this was their chance to show what a god of death has up their sleeve besides writing people down in notebooks and bumming around in the Shinigami world. Like some real hurricane versus volcanic eruption force of nature type stuff. Instead, Ryuk just rolls over and then they have the third guy hang around for the remainder of the episode for literally no reason. Then there's the Amogus Council arc. Oh my heavens, what a waste of time. I get that it was an attempt to make Light look like a super genius doing 5D chess with multiversal time travel, but let's be real, these 8 episodes could have been condensed down to a 2, maybe a 3-parter. This was also a great opportunity to contrast a selfish Death Note wielder with Light's the ends justify the means philosophy, but to be frank, that didn't feel like the focus. The setup was far too obvious for a payoff that took way too long to pan out. But hey, on the bright side, we got one of the most iconic anime memes of all time out of it. Speaking of iconic anime memes, the infamous potato chip scene. I actually thought this was alright. Really, the only thing that ruins it for me is that despite the fact that this very clearly should have removed suspicion from Light for at least a little while, L doesn't let up at all. That's another thing that gets under my skin. The series does have flashes of brilliance where they manage to actually make a satisfying setup and payoff. Case in point, the scene where Light gets Penbar to kill off his entire FBI team. Using the Death Note to manipulate the FBI team lead into sending Penbar a list of all the agents on the team was pretty clever. In fact, I'd say that this scene is the single most intelligent use of the Death Note in the entire series. The problem is that, like so many other things in the series, they completely whiff the follow-up. Up until this point, I was frustrated that Light didn't seem to know what the Streisand effect was. However, I then realized that that could have been the point. The fact that Penbar's fiancé started investigating Kira as a result of Penbar getting killed by Light seemed to back this up. This is it, I thought. This is how they'll show a logical sequence of events that causes Light to become corrupted by his power. He starts with only killing criminals. Then as he starts to come under suspicion, he begins stamping out those investigating him under the line of reasoning that he can't change the world if he gets arrested. And that in turn devolves as the Streisand effect brings only more suspicion. The more he kills to try and get people off his back, the stronger the investigation efforts become, until he arrives at the conclusion that it's okay to kill anyone who opposes him. And yeah, the series kinda does that, but not because of a believable cascade of slip-ups that cause Light to fall under more scrutiny. Instead, Light gets away with killing Penbar's fiancé, but then is still suspected because, once again, L just has a hunch. Seriously, I thought that the scene where a guy from the police station passes by as Light has just won against Penbar's fiancé was a Chekhov's gun for a follow-up scene where that guy goes, "Hey, come to think of it, I saw that lady who went missing last with Light. What's up with that?" But nope, it was just to show that Light got her name correct. Why is it that whenever I saw an interesting direction the show could have gone, the writers instead chose to steer away from that and choose the dumbest possible thing to happen next? It seems to me that they were trying to set up the series to be akin to a Greek tragedy, but man, it doesn't really work for me. In the end, Light gets done in not because of his hubris or his corruption, but because the person he chose to entrust with his power made a minor slip-up. And yeah, I guess it's still indirectly because of Light's hubris, but it's not nearly as cathartic as if the slip-up was made by Light directly. Also, why does the series never even consider that some of the convicts that Light killed might have been falsely imprisoned? That could have been another angle to show Light's corruption, because they could have had Light find out that someone he killed was actually innocent, but then he brushes it to the side because he doesn't care about the truth, only what the law thinks. In addition, I think it would have completed Light's corruption if it culminated in him killing someone through conventional means, rather than using the Death Note, just to cement him as a cold-blooded killer. Also, it's not really important, but the line where a character states that the Death Note is the worst murder weapon in history is certainly a take to have when presumably nukes still exist. I don't know, unless Death Note actually takes place in an alternate timeline where World War II largely played out the same but Japan didn't get nuked. And, the Cold War nuclear test didn't happen, or Vietnam's Agent Orange never happened, or World War I never used mustard gas. Heck, don't even get me started on this freaking thing. So, unless that's the case, it's just objectively wrong that the Death Note is the worst murder weapon in history because of how humanely a Death Note can be used to kill. and most importantly, how it kills by default. Cardiac arrest certainly doesn't strike me as the most peaceful death possible, but it certainly beats a lot of ways to die. Also, the death note is targeted and never hits an unintended target, at least not in the way a nuke indiscriminately annihilates everything within the blast radius. On top of that, the death note causes virtually no environmental fallout when compared to a nuke, unless you went out of your way to have it do that. So no, a death note would not be the worst murder weapon in history. In general, Death Note as a series really reminds me of the kinds of stories I would write in high school. It would have a bunch of cool concepts and ideas for scenarios and moments that were really awesome, and then everything else was kinda there to loosely string everything together. It wasn't really about the characters so much as making sure that the plot got to the next twist or set piece. While Death Note undoubtedly stands out even amongst the landscape of anime today, the reason why I have no love for this series is that I realize that I already have something I like that does everything Death Note does, but better. Code Geass. While it may seem like I'm comparing apples and oranges here, hear me out. Both series are about a guy who is a high school genius and they live relatively ordinary lives until randomly, another character gives them a supernatural ability that can cause anyone they want to die. The main character then attempts to use this power to change the world according to their personal sense of justice, which usually involves having the ends justify the means. Along the way, they develop a rivalry with someone who rises to prominence within their local government that is also ideologically opposed to them, and repeatedly clashes with them throughout the entire series. And said rivalry is perpetuated by one of the pair not knowing the true identity of the other. The main character also has multiple women throw themselves at him, and he winds up using them for his own ends. And in the end, their power becomes their undoing. However, Code Geass executes on all of the ideas it touches on far better than Death Note, and on top of that manages to balance political intrigue, character drama, the collateral damage that war can cause both immediately and years after it's over, the advancement of technology and how it changes tactics and strategy, and awesome mecha action. Geass as a power is far more interesting than the Death Note because it's more limited. Lelouch is shown to be a very smart character by how he continually tests the limits of Geass and then leverages it to change the odds in his favor. And yet, the series also has him make various mistakes that are completely believable without undermining his credibility as a genius. They actually take the time to develop the rival dynamic between Lelouch and Suzaku in a way that not only allows them to hash out their differences in worldviews, but also in a way that feels organic. And most importantly, Code Geass actually manages to stick the landing with its ending, while Death Note is infamous for having an unsatisfying ending that is widely disliked. It's that ending that has given Death Note a legacy of being a masterpiece at the start, tainted by its finish. But to me, the entire thing is hard carried by its premise and subsequently fails to capitalize on it for the entirety of its runtime. It's for that reason why I think that Death Note was never good.